Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this early. It's nice to see your early birds and you're here. My name is Elisabet Cantenys. I'm the Executive Director at the ACOS Alliance. We are a coalition that brings together news organizations, journalism, NGOs, and freelance press associations to really cultivate a culture of safety in our ecosystem. And this is the first panel that takes off the safety and well-being track. I really encourage you to look into the program and see how many of these sessions you can attend. And it's very much linked to the safety clinics. This is our third year in a row that we are providing safety one-to-one clinics to individual journalists and editors participating in the festival. And these are one-to-one sort of individual sessions where you can have access to safety experts. And this is what brings me to introduce this panel, because these three wonderful people here are individuals providing that individual support to anyone who may be interested in registering. We're doing these every year with partners and ACOS signatories this year with CPJ, but also Freedom of the Press Foundation, RESIDENT.ngo, and the Van Center. Very quickly, I'm going to introduce Mike Christie, who is a former general manager at Reuters and also former ACOS board member. Then Mykola Kostynyan, who is digital security expert and also co-founder of RESIDENT.ngo, and Lauren Walsh, director at Gallatin, Photojournalism intensive at New York University. And I wonder if you can say, like, very briefly about yourselves, each of you. Who wants to start? Mike.
Okay. I'll start. I was with Reuters for 30 years as a journalist and as a bureau chief. I was bureau chief in places like Baghdad and Miami for Hurricane Katrina. I left Reuters at the end of 23 to set myself up as a consultant. I'm still in Trump world in Miami. I think we're all in Trump world, so it's quite busy as a consultant at the moment. But I'm trying to make a living that way these days.
So hi, my name is Mykola. I do digital security to civil society organizations and independent media in Eastern Europe countries. My usual countries are Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. I also organize capacity building to digital security practitioners in the region, like regional events, convenience, capacity buildings, etc. And recently we established with two colleagues the RESIDENT.ngo, a security service provider based in Vilnius, Lithuania, to do all the same, but, with the legal registration.
Hi, I'm Lauren Walsh, and I think of myself as straddling photojournalism and academia. So I'm the founding director of the Photojournalism Intensive at NYU, and so that positions me as an educator and a researcher and a writer. But I also have a specialty in conflict photography, and over the years of working very closely with conflict photographers as an advisor and at times as an ethicist and an editor, I started to see patterns in mental health, and so began specializing in that and doing surveys and writing about that, and now working in this space alongside these excellent colleagues.
Thank you so much. And here on the screen, you have the QR code. There are still some spaces available if you want to have a one-to-one. These clinics specialize on psychological well-being, digital security, physical safety, and legal awareness as well. And I want to start with you, Mike, because we are focusing today on prevention and mitigation. Why is this so important? I mean, things can go wrong anyway, so what's the point?
You know, I think too many of us journalists, we think of safety as something extra, as a luxury that we can't afford, or maybe even as an impediment to the work that we do, something that gets in the way of journalism. But over the years that I worked at Reuters, and when I ran safety there for my last 10 years, the view I developed was it was an enabler. It actually helped us to do better jobs as journalists if we thought about the safety considerations If you're thinking about information security, for example, and you do a better job at protecting the information that your sources give you, where your sources can trust you, with more sensitive information, they'll give you better stories. If you're thinking about covering a hurricane or an earthquake and you're not taking the time to think ahead about the things that you need for food, fuel, clean water, the way you're going to communicate, all of these kind of safety and logistics considerations, you're not going to do as good a job as a journalist that goes into that situation, thinking ahead, risk assessing, and being planning for it. And on the emotional side, if you go into a war zone unprepared emotionally, well, you can destroy your career. You're going to go into burnout. You're going to destroy the relationships that matter to you, and you're not going to be doing running that 20, 30-year career that you hoped for, because you're going to be finished after 10 years of that kind of job. So, I think it's time for us as journalists to think of safety as core to what we do, part of the workflow, the news planning and the news gathering process. If you think about you're putting a story together, who do I interview? What visuals do I need? What facts do I need to check? Why not in the same breath think about what are the risks that I might run on the legal or the emotional side, or the physical dangers that I might encounter, or the information security risks, and what can I do about that? It's all part of the same process.
I always say that safety is not the salt and pepper that you put on top of the plate, but it's actually an essential ingredient into the recipe. I want us to really focus on very practical solutions, very practical things that we can do, and I wonder whether if each of you can tell us now 3 top recommendations that you would give to any journalist or any editor out there. Lauren, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm going to build a little bit on what Mike was just saying. So, okay, 3. One would be risk assessments, before, during, and after assessing what's going on with the assignment. 2, normalizing that psychological or mental health must be an integral part of the risk assessment, again, before, during, and after an assignment. And then I think the third thing I would say, again, building a little bit on what you said, Mike, about referencing war zones, is that my specialty has been over the years conflict and crisis, and that is what sort of launched me into the mental health space, because sometimes you see more dramatic mental health reactions. But I actually think we should be considering and assessing and planning for mental health concerns well beyond conflict spaces. And I think every journalist and every newsroom should be thinking about this and anticipating what are some of the emotional risks, how do I mitigate them, and it'll just make for a stronger culture of care throughout the industry.
Thank you, Lauren. Mykola, top 3.
The first one would be risk management as a systematic, continuous, never-ending process conducted by the management. The next one probably would be, for the separate teams with different risk, different security contexts, there might be a need for some separate, risk management subsystems, let's say, with their own decision-making and implementation mechanism. And for a separate freelancer, maybe not very good news. I would say to find an organization and try them to include you into their security practices, inside their security perimeter. And this security perimeter, for the organization not to overlook people, systems, accounts, messengers, smartphones, etc., we see all the time what something super important somehow is not included into the security perimeter, it does not exist. So please do.
And I'm gonna echo actually my 2 colleagues here, but just add one thing. Yes, risk assessment. I think for every story you do, there's going to be some kind of physical risk, some kind of legal risk, some kind of emotional challenge. And some kind of information security element, not in equal measure. You know, a story may be primarily about physical risk and emotional challenges, or it might be primarily about information security. But if you think of, you know, looking at every story you're doing, just asking those kind of 4 questions, then I think you're on the right track. And people get really scared about this word risk assessment. You know, they think it's a PDF, a form, or something, but it's not. It's a state of mind more than anything. For me, it's any journalist who can ask questions, who's inquisitive, you know, and interested in the world, who can analyze information, can do a risk assessment. It's just looking at the situation and understanding the challenges that might come out of it, and then thinking, oh, what are the little things I can do? Yes, experts, security experts can be really important in some situations, but for 99% of what we as journalists do, you can be the risk assessor and the safety expert for yourself. And then in addition to thinking holistically, making sure that you think very broadly about risks, I would say planning preparation for me turned out to be the number 1 thing. You cannot, you know, react to an earthquake when it starts shaking. You cannot buy fuel when the hurricanes, winds are already blowing at 80 miles per hour. And the storm surge is coming up the shore. You know, you've got to think about risks ahead of time. If all you do is just reacting in the moment, you're placing yourself in enormous danger, and you're not going to be able to do your jobs very well.
So in a way, it's thinking about worst case scenario, right?
Yeah, you know, I mean, sometimes I'd ask myself when I was running security at Reuters, do I have to prepare for the meteor impact? You know, or hey, COVID, you know, the next pandemic. Back in the day, I was thinking, is that really going to happen in my lifetime? Well, you can't tell, and you might not have to prepare for that asteroid strike, but you can prepare for a disaster, right? You know, you prepare at the very basic level, and that gets you ready for the really extreme stuff that might just, you know, come around the corner and whip you in the face.
But we work with many under-resourced journalists and many under-resourced newsrooms, and some of the things that you're referring to could be quite expensive. So do you need a lot of money to invest in your safety? How you get around, I mean, Mykola, you were mentioning before, if you're a freelance journalist, right? How you get around the issue of not having enough resources, because that's a reality.
So it is expensive, even though it might be not the money, but it is always expensive. The management process and responsible people and their time and energy and everything, and then the architecture of all the IT systems, let's say, and good devices and corporate systems, storages and everything. I'm not even mentioning the specialized, I don't know, corporate antiviruses, etc. So for a separate journalist, well, I'm really afraid that it's better to join, I don't know, a community organization or a newsroom with you believe has a good security practices, and somehow to ask them to include you into their systems, into their processes, procedures. So from the perspective of the organization, it is really expensive. And from perspective of a separate person, it might be not even possible to reach the level of security you might want to.
Lauren, what happens when you don't have the resources?
I think you can find the resources. And I suppose I would echo a bit, there are ways in which some of the planning or some of the work can cost money. In the mental health space, I think there are a lot of options that don't have to cost money. I mean, there's online resources, right? And ACOS has a lot of resources. But I think just becoming aware of mental health as an integral aspect of safety is vital. And so there was a study in 2022, and it was specific to a population of Canadian journalists, but the study showed that 85% of the journalists had never had any kind of trauma training in their newsroom. So it's a very high percentage, and that means that, I mean, that's why we're doing this work here, and it means that we all have to do more to be thinking about mental health and psychological impacts. In terms of what are the cost-effective solutions, getting more familiar with this kind of language and with some of the emotional risks is free. I would echo what Mike was saying, that anyone can do this. You don't have to be inside a newsroom. And of course, please come to the clinics if you want advice on this. But it's not just protective of you and your emotional state of being. It's very empowering to feel like I have an aspect of control. And that alone provides a sort of shield of resilience for a journalist. I would say the other kind of cost-effective or low-cost measures are trying to create, if you're a newsroom, inside a newsroom, peer-to-peer support structures or peer-to-management support structures if you're outside of a newsroom because you're freelance. Networks are very important, and they don't have to be professional networks, but understanding that you can have a social network to fall back on if things start to get tough. And I think the other thing that I would say as a kind of low cost, I was just in Ukraine conducting a survey on mental health for the broad media sector. And as you can imagine, it's a wartime setting, so there were very high levels of burnout, very high levels of depression, very high levels of anxiety, probably to be expected, right, in a space like that. One of the things, though, that was consistent across every single journalist I spoke with, in addition to whatever else they were grappling with, every single one said in some form or other, I feel like I'm working really hard and I'm not getting enough acknowledgement for what I'm doing. So I think the simple statement, let's say from an editor to a journalist to say, job well done, do you want to talk about this, actually makes a huge difference.
How the power of that validation, right? Mike, risk assessments are for free, right?
I always had the luxury of being in a well-resourced organization. Reuters obviously, takes safety very seriously and was prepared to invest in it. But I do think there are an awful lot of baseline things that every journalist can do with, spending very little money. I mean, information security is what, a VPN subscription at a very basic level, a few bits of software that you've got on your phone and your computer, and some really good basic practices, password manager, that kind of thing. It doesn't have to cost a bomb or cost the earth. On the emotional side, it's about resilience. Primarily, how do you prepare yourself for the situation that you're going into? It's not always just about paying for counseling after the fact. It's about what you do to live, a healthy life, to look after your well-being, to prepare yourself psychologically for the situations you get into, and that doesn't have to cost a lot of money. Sleep well, eat good, all that kind of stuff. Do exercise, have a life, have friends, support, So you don't need to invest. I do think I'm a very strong believer after all these years in safety training. I think that there are so many lessons we've learned over the decades that we need to pass on to other journalists. Why do we have to learn everything from scratch, as individuals? And safety training can be expensive, but I think it is worth investing in.
Mykola, this year we're doing something special. It's the first year that we're doing scan devices as part of the safety clinics, and I'm sure someone here might be interested in hearing what exactly is this service, what you're offering. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, these are like usual quick checks for targeted spyware for iPhones and Androids using the Citizen Labs and Amnesty tags automatic system. So if you have direct access to their check-in system, so it is the same, or if you attend any other event with their table, they're checking all the devices, it is the same. So if you want to check or recheck iPhone, Android, for the quick test only, it's a quick test. So just please come, it's not taking a long time. So it is not actually scanning your device, it's you generating a sysdiagnose or bug report file on your device and sending it to their lab to scan it.
Thank you. And you have the schedule here at the back. It's the first year that we're doing this as part of the safety clinics. Hashtag Spazio is really behind Brufani. It's a 2-minute walk, so it's not far from here. Lauren, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience with the safety clinics? What kind of advice you're able to provide, how far you can go?
Sure. So yeah, I did the clinics last year. There are, as I recall, 50-minute sessions.
50, yeah.
50-minute sessions. And they were great. I do encourage you to do them. I met with, and of course I'm here in the space of kind of mental health, psychosocial safety. And so you meet one-on-one, you get extremely individualized feedback. I met with visual journalists, I met with reporters, I met with editors, and it could be anything from, I did an assignment a year ago and I think I'm still struggling with something from it. What do I do? Can we talk about it? It can be, how do I develop my own risk assessment that takes my emotional well-being into account? It can be, I don't at all work at anywhere near a war zone. What are the things I need to think about in terms of mental health? And then when I met with editors, they were taking a kind of more bird's eye view on how do I bring this into the newsroom? How do I help individual journalists? How do I help a whole cohort of journalists? So that's sort of what I was doing last year, and each of my colleagues with their areas of expertise were able to give one-on-one input specific to the journalist or the individual who shows up for a session.
Thank you, Lauren. And we also have here in the audience Harlow Holmes and Alex Papachristou. Sorry, I'm spotting you now. But they are also part of the clinics, and they are available across these 3 days to support you on, Alex, in your case, on legal awareness, and Harlow, in your case, on digital security, source protection, etc. So thank you so much. It is a teamwork, so it's many of us working together to provide these surveys. Is there any burning question from the floor? Yes, I think we can take 1 or 2 questions before we wrap up. Yes.
Thank you so much for organizing this panel. My question is more about, my name is Zahra Nader. I'm an Afghan journalist. I run a media that works with women journalists in Afghanistan and in exile. So the question is, the preparation is a great, totally on board with the plan. Sorry. Okay, sorry, thank you. So my name is Zahra Nader. I'm an Afghan journalist. I work with women journalists in Afghanistan and in exile. So my question is, we always think about safety, but it goes back to the question of funding. Because you, as a journalist, how can I be prepared, planning? I can talk with my peers, I can get feedback, I can get guidance, but how to translate that into action, that needs money. So, like, do you have any suggestion for, like, creating, or there are organizations that do provide support for creating an emergency plan, contingency plan? And if they do, like, do they serve, like, communities in, like, places in Afghanistan? Because I really feel the discussion of safety is very different here than in a war zone. And so the question is more about immediate physical risk to these people who could be arrested, who could be detained, who could be even killed. And literally there is not a lot that I, as a journalist, can do to support these people. So if you have a concrete suggestion, especially for the journalists who are covering war, conflict, the immediate risk to the people's life, I would really appreciate that, and that we can follow up and think, what can we do? Thank you so much.
I would say specifically in the context of Afghanistan, there is an organization that I'm sure is represented here, IMS, has been working quite extensively, and they've been supporting a lot of individuals and newsrooms to actually develop protocols and emergency response protocols. You also have CPJ provides emergency support. So you have, in case if you are interested in more like support in terms of responding to an emergency, there is a group called Journalists in Distress Network. They have a website, and you have a list of organizations that are prepared to provide emergency support. But again, IMS more as an organization that has done quite a lot of groundwork in Afghanistan, also with organizations in exile, originally from Afghanistan, but Mykola.
Yeah, just to add, there are different options for the decisions about the risks, and one of the options is to avoid it. I mean, if the magnitude of the risk is unacceptable, don't do the story. It is a real option. Sometimes journalists does not want to see it. So don't go there, don't do the story. There is an option.
we have a few minutes left. Maybe we can wrap it up very quickly. Lauren, final remarks. What would you say?
Oh, I hadn't prepared any brilliant final remarks. I might just follow up on the question that we just received by way of acknowledging that you're right to point out that different spaces, different cultures, different individuals, different profiles need different assessments and different protections. And you can try to sort of break it down and create contingencies along many different vectors. And I think the organizations that Elisabeth announced are phenomenal. And I would encourage you also just to come for a clinic to try to get very one-on-one input.
Well, since I mentioned avoiding the risk, like don't do the story, I have to mention the other option, like to accept the risk. Well, we don't have resources, the risk is, I don't know, unacceptable, but we decide to accept it. We have the right to do that, but please do inform all the involved people that we are accepting huge risk. Thank you.
I think risk is always local, right? You can be very generic about in talking about risks for journalists around the world, but then the nitty-gritty of being in Afghanistan is going to be far more acute in Myanmar or the front line in Ukraine versus Kiev. So yeah, it's always local. I think it is really important to weigh the risk versus the reward for every story. You know, what am I getting out of this, rather than just thinking about, I have a right to get the story as a journalist. Because it is a risk to you, so you have to decide how important it is and whether you accept that level of risk. And organizations make those decisions for themselves as well. What is their appetite, their level of risk, what is their tolerance, versus how important is this particular story that we're going for. So, every risk assessment is this kind of balancing act, and there's no perfect answer. You can't just wipe out. Risk assessing isn't about wiping out risk. It's about identifying the risk, deciding at what level you're comfortable accepting it, and what can you do to reduce it to a manageable level.
Thank you so much, Lauren, Mykola, and Mike. You referred to safety as empowering, enabler, producing better stories, and I would add start now. So don't delay. Whatever you do, even if you start with something tiny, with a drop, it doesn't matter, right? Start now. Thank you so much, everyone.